So I have a very tough task ahead of me. I hope you can bear with me. And I also feel like the odd apple here, because I'm not talking about a specific project. I'll be talking more about a conceptual framework for the water, energy, food security, and water security in the Arab region. So basically, I'll just run quickly through some of the regional systemic conditions. I'm not talking about the national, but more about the general regional systemic conditions, how that plays with the Agenda 2030, the Nexus concept, presenting a conceptual framework for the water, energy, food security in the Arab region, water security concepts, and then going on to a conceptual framework for water security in the Arab region. So basically, if we look at the Arab region, we know all that it's very water scarce. Basically, we have about 360 million people living in water scarce countries. 86% of the Arab population is living in water scarce countries. If we look at the water sources in the Arab region, we realize that most of the water is either coming from groundwater or desalination, and more recently from treated wastewater. And that's very high energy demanding in the region. And if you look at the Gulf on the map, it's all desalination and groundwater, which is very high energy demanding. Only a few countries rely on surface water, and even these countries are switching to groundwater. If we're looking for water for food security, we all realize that about 84% of all water being withdrawn, it goes to the agriculture sector, and that has a very big demand in the region. And that's not even enough for food security. We also have virtual water, which is importing the products into the region, with only 2 countries. Syria used to be a water importing, it's not anymore. Then we look at the effects of water on health, and we realize the large amount of waterborne diseases, which are intrinsically linked to deficiencies in the wastewater and water and sanitation systems in the region. In the Arab region, we have about 74 million people are still lacking basic sanitation services. And if you look at the LDCs, they have the highest attributed mortality rate to the lack of wash services, and then followed by countries in the Mashriq. And if you look at countries that are in conflict, they also have high mortality rates, such as Iraq and Syrian Arab Republic. We also know that there's a very high percentage of population living in cities. 58% lives in cities, and even in those, 94% there's more concentrated efforts on drinking water, and only 42% are receiving safely managed sanitation services. So there's even differences within these. And we're shifting more water towards the city, which is causing more immigration and more migration, internal migration from rural areas, which are having a big social implication on the region. We also know that the region depends greatly on shared water surfaces, where we have 2/3 of freshwater resources in the Arab region being shared water surfaces. And it's even more for when we look at groundwater resources. All of the Arab countries share an aquifer with one or another country, except for Comoros. And then if we look at the climate change, and one of the initiatives that has been coordinated by ESQA looked at climate change effects, the RICAR project, and there was an earlier presentation on that earlier today. And from that project, we know that there's a general increase in temperature. Precipitation trends are largely decreasing in the region by the end of the century, and overall there will be drier conditions with more dry days and droughts in the Arab region. If we look at water services for all, intermittent supply is the story in the region. If you're connected, you're not getting water. It doesn't mean that you're getting water in this region, and Jordan is a loud example of that. Conflict and its effects cannot be ignored in this. There's a lot of armed conflicts that's destroying the water and sanitation infrastructures, and the resulting in internal displaced persons, where the Arab region hosts 41% of the world internal displaced persons. Also, we look at refugees, and so the conflict is not only affecting the countries, It's also affecting the neighboring countries, and examples of that can be seen here in Jordan, in Lebanon, and Turkey. So we have water-scarce countries with a sudden influx of population making things worse for them. And the Arab region and basically Palestine is the only country in the world that still suffers from occupation that affects its access to its water resources, its ability to manage its water resources. And I won't go into the numbers on what's happening in Gaza, in West Bank, and the severe restrictions on even importing parts to service the water systems and the wastewater systems, because the Israelis consider that these parts have dual uses. And so you have a lot of infrastructure that's not operational and not being able to be repaired due to these import restrictions. So we have all of these problems. We are proposing, or everyone has been, not us, but everyone has been talking about a nexus approach. And that's coupled from our point of view with the 2030 agenda. So what does the 2030 agenda has to do with the nexus? So basically people a lot, when they talk about the 2030 agenda, we're only now focusing on indicators and numbers and reporting in numbers, and people tend to forget the vision. Why do we have the Agenda 2030? And basically I'd like to always read that to sort of pull us back when we're talking about resources and the vision of the 2030. It says a word where we reaffirm, this is the countries that reaffirm, our commitment regarding the human right of safe drinking water and sanitation. There is improved hygiene, where food is sufficient, safe, affordable, nutritious, where human habitats are safe, resilient, sustainable, and where there is universal access to affordable, reliable, and sustainable energy. If that's not a nexus there, a nexus based on human rights, I don't know what it is. It's not spelled out in the Agenda 2030, but that if you read the vision, you know that we're talking about an integrated approach that talks about human rights. And you see that throughout the Agenda 2030. So it's an integrated, it talks about goals that are integrated and indivisible throughout the agenda. They are universal, indivisible, integrated, people-centered. They seek to achieve gender equality and balance the sustainable development pillars. So again, interlinkages and integrated nature of the Sustainable Development Goals are of crucial importance in ensuring that the purpose of the new agenda is realized. This is all taken out from the Agenda 2030, and I blame ourselves, the UN agencies, that we've tended to focus in this more on the indicators, on reporting and monitoring, and we have sort of let that vision pass us by. So having that in mind, in ESPO a few years back, we published a water development report which gave a conceptual framework for how we see the nexus in the region. So basically the goal that we have to all remember, we want sustainable development in this region. And if we're talking about resources, we're talking SDG 2, which deals with food, SDG 6 with water, SDG 7 with energy, and that's tied to energy security, water security, and food security. And how do we balance between these demands, and how do we balance between the exchanges between the water, the energy, the food, the securities? We believe that the best way, the common ground to respect that and ensure that the rights of all are respected is a human rights-based approach that balances and ensures that if you're talking about efficiency, you don't forget the rights of the people. If you're talking efficiency in agriculture, there's a social aspect to it. And so that has to be balanced with a human rights-based approach. And it also takes into consideration the climate change and its impacts, the cross-sectorial impact on energy, on water, and on food. And that's also building on some regional knowledge that has been gained, whether it's the IWRM, Sustainable Energy for All, or Sustainable Agriculture and Trade. Now what I want to move now, shift quickly with whatever I have left, or 5 minutes or something or less, is to focus on, from that conceptual framework for Nexus, we sort of zoomed into a water security framework. And when we're talking about security, there's basically no one universal definition of what water security should be. But mostly up to the 90s, we were talking about water security, we were talking about quality, if you have enough, quantity, if you have enough quantity, and focusing more on sufficient and safe supply. There's been a shift in that in more recent years, And there's been a lot of definitions that have sort of become sort of the standard for water security. There's the Hague Ministerial Declaration, the Gray and Sadov definition for water security, and more recently, the UN Water 2013 definition. And these talk about sustainable access to adequate quantities of acceptable quality of water, sustaining livelihoods, now we're talking human well-being, socioeconomic development, protection against waterborne pollution and water-related diseases, and preserving ecosystems in a climate of peace and political stability. So we've widened that definition of water security to encompass a lot of things. And I think that's sort of based on that progress that has been done. A lot of work has been done on making water and sanitation human rights. That started back in the 1976 in the Vancouver Declaration, was more affirmed in the Mar del Plata UN Water Conference in 77, where water was set as a right, all the way to 2010, where the General Assembly declared the rights to safe and clean drinking water, and more recently with the UN General Assembly having human rights. So now we have a human right for sanitation and a human right for water. And that has been surprisingly to some of you, but it has been paralleled in the Arab region. So we have the Arab Charter on Human Rights in 2008, which talked about the provision of basic nutrition and safe drinking water for all in the League of Arab States, and proper sanitation system. And even at the national level, at the highest level in the constitutions, Morocco has equal access of citizens to conditions that permit the enjoyment of the right to access to water and to healthy environment. In Tunisia, the right of water shall be guaranteed. That's also in the constitution, Article 44. In Egypt, each citizen has the right to healthy, sufficient amount of food and clean water. So there has been some work in that. What I've also done is looking at water security and sustainable development. I've taken all of these definitions. I won't go through a reading exercise with you, but a lot of these components in these definitions, you can map them within that 2030 agenda and within that 2030 sustainable goals and developments into different pillars of access. So you can do that for the Hague Water Declaration, we did that for the Gray and Sadov, and finally for the UN Water. And you see that the concerns of water security can be mapped within all of these SDGs and not just SDG 6. And also, the water security strategy in the Arab region that has been adopted by the Arab Ministerial Water Council in the League of Arab States also talked about water security to meet the challenge and future needs of sustainable development. And more recently, the GCC Unified Water Sector Strategy also talked about contributing to their sustainable and social economic development. So that concept of water security for sustainable development and sustainable development for water security has been enshrined in the region. So working from that nexus into the conceptual framework for water security, we look at the framework that looks into all of the systemic conditions of the region, the water stress, scarcity, the shared water resources, the climate change, and it looks at all scales of water security, from the regional to the national to the household. And that's considering a human rights-based approach that guarantees that no one is left behind, gender equality, and considers the human rights, and also looks at the pillar of sustainable development, looking at the economic, social, environmental, and the cross-sectorial linkages for that. And looks at means of implementation that go from governance to cooperation, financing and investment, research and technology development, resilience and construction, and capacity building, to ensure that water security within that broader concept of the water, energy, food security nexus. The importance is that the interchanges is not always about economy and efficiencies. We believe that the grounding in the human rights-based approach would guarantee that the rights of all, at all scales, from the household to the national to the regional, are respected, which is critical in this region. Thank you.
Thank you, Ziad. Any question? Ziad, please. Can you please hand the mic?
Thank you for the presentation. I'm Raad Daoud from EcoConsult. And it's interesting to look at the frameworks for basically sustainability and good governance, including the ones on water security, and where has basically, the time frame where things have developed. And a couple of weeks ago, I was also in The Hague in a conference on planetary water security, which also touched on different types of things related to what we're talking about here. So the frameworks, whether we're talking about in the developed world or in the region, they're there. But when you look at the situation on the ground, you look at the situation in Yemen, you look at the situation even, in countries like Lebanon and Jordan and Egypt and Tunisia, we're really far away from where the frameworks are. And it's interesting, we can continue to work on these frameworks, but we see very little implementation when it comes to having initiatives on the ground that bring difference to the people. And overall governance, when we talk about, the right to water and the right to sanitation, and all these rights are in the constitutions, such as also the freedom of speech and all other rights, human rights, they are also in the constitutions of these countries. But the overall governance, whether it's water or it got to do with other things, I think, it's still lacking. And I think, we need to really move away from frameworks and theories and looking at what the governance structures are and where the constitutions are, to having real implementation on the ground and making a difference on the ground. Because no matter what, countries are very good in adopting and adapting and copying what others are putting in, but the reality is painful and far away from what's written in these constitutions. Thank you.
Thank you. I think if the reality was different, we wouldn't be talking about frameworks. I think this provides an overall roadmap, if you want. You do these initiatives within having in mind this framework and this roadmap that you have to work within it. Frameworks alone are useless. And if you do initiatives here and there without having a clear idea of where you want to go, where that should lead you to, and I think you'd be lost too. So I think you cannot just sort of do this alone or do that alone. I totally agree with you. Frameworks alone